So this unit is on employees' rights. Yes, employees have rights. The reality, of course, is that a employment contract is just that, a contract. The business has rights, the employee has rights. The employee needs to honor the business's rights within that transaction of employment, and the employer needs to honor the rights of the employees. Now, some companies very much value their employees, and other companies not so much. The ethics involved here is simply that because you are a human being with human rights, you are owed certain obligations and rights in any situation, and that includes employment. So companies that place employees in a valued position and treat them fairly are not just obeying the law and not just obeying the rules of ethics. They're probably cultivating a better work outcome, because happier employees do better and are more productive than unhappy employees. If you've ever walked into a store or a restaurant and you kind of feel a little weird about people, or people seem a little short and rude to you, it may very well be because they're not being treated well by their employers. So from a strictly utilitarian perspective, treating employees probably is a good thing. And yet that's not been the case both historically and even currently. The age-old battle between employees and employers goes way, way back. We'll try to stay out of the whole Marxist thing here, although obviously we should do a simple nod to the fact that Karl Marx did talk about how badly employees are treated, and therefore employees will rise up. The workers will unite and rise up and overthrow the evil shackles of capitalism. But what Marx didn't get was that even though, yes, there is a lot of abuse of employees that go on, employees can do something other than simply tear down everything, burn down everything, and have a revolution. One of the things that people did do, partially inspired by Marxism, is form trade unions. Unions go back to the old trade guilds that, if you were a jeweler, if you were a carpenter, if you were a mason, you formed a guild of your craft. And labor unions come out of that idea, but they mostly come out of the late 19th century, mid-19th century. You have factory workers who are, quote, unskilled or lesser skilled than artisans, and trade unions fought for decent rights for workers, and that's why you only work 5 days a week, only work 40 hours a week, have benefits like insurance and various other things that have all been won because of the struggles of unions. Well, what has been a response to that historically is that corporations that want to limit their expense of labor, and labor is one of the biggest expenses that any business has, they develop this idea of employment at will. And that means that the people who work for a company have actually no real right to work there. It's an at-will contract, and that means that the employer can break the contract or terminate the employment at any time. Now, the idea is also that the employee can quit at any time. However, because of the simple dynamic and reality of any employment situation, the power and the money is with the employer, not the employee. Now, it is a wonderful thing to be able to say, oh, I don't like this job anymore, I want to quit, I want to move across the country, I want to do this, that, or the other thing, and you can just leave your job. That's a good thing. But it's probably not so much a good thing that any one company can fire any one employee for any reason at all, no notice, no severance, no even rational justification for it, just, I don't like you anymore, go away. And the employee has no recourse, and they're out of a job. Now, there's a lot of legalities involved here, and legalities of employment at will is that there are certain legal means by which you are a protected class because of race, because of religion, because of various things, gender, where you cannot be fired for simply that. And therefore, employees have a certain amount of due process, and there must be just cause for an employer to fire you, even in an at-will situation. Labor unions go into this situation and negotiate with employers that there are certain job security guarantees such that you can't be fired for absolutely no just cause. The employer needs to establish that this person didn't do their job right, or they showed up drunk too often, or just something. There's a reason why they are fired. And that's something that we can really understand as just basic human decency, that you don't do things to people unless there's a reason. One of the absolute rights of any employee is to not suffer discrimination, to not suffer bullying or disadvantage because of their race or their religion. U.S. law has slowly expanded over the years to include ideas of a right to be free from discrimination. It was just last week, as of my speaking of this, that the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed the right that people who are lesbian, gay, or bi have a right to not be discriminated in the workplace. That's been on the laws in a number of states, but now it's a matter of federal law. There was a time, not that long ago, when you could fire someone for being black, you could fire someone for being a woman, you could fire someone for being of this, that, or the other religion, and just on and on and on. But slowly the law has expanded to say that, okay, if they are otherwise a good employee, you can't fire them simply because you don't like them for being a this, that, or the other thing. Now, most of us would say that that's an ethical responsibility that people have to not be bigots. Unfortunately, there are some people, and it's happening right now as we speak, that I have a right to fire someone that I don't like. No one has a right to tell me that I have to employ someone. And that does bring up another issue that is worth considering. Do I have to be forced to employ someone that I don't like? It's just something to consider, because there's always two sides to everything, and as a good philosopher, we have to consider both sides. That doesn't mean that we have to make them equal and say that the right to be a bigot is somehow equal to the right to not suffer bigotry. But that's something to consider. The reality in business as well is that some businesses fail, some businesses do poorly, the economy does poorly, various things happen, and a business for various reasons need to contract, or the buzzword now is downsize. That does happen, and a business does have a need and a right to be able to say, our current income and revenues in sales of our products and services is such that we cannot afford to keep and don't even need all the employees that we have, and therefore we are going to downsize. We are going to cut jobs. It's a horrible thing, but a business has a right to cut costs. A business has a need to cut labor costs in order to survive as a business. But here too, largely because of union labor contracts, there must be a due process involved in downsizing, in cutting jobs, one of which is the idea of seniority. The people who are cut first in a downsizing are the people that have been there the least amount of time, first in, first out idea. If you've been on the job for 30 years, then you have the right to keep your job over someone who has just been there for 3 weeks. There are a lot of ethical decisions that go into downsizing in terms of who you fire and why. Why is the company downsizing? One quick story from my personal history. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, it was a big tech boom, and they were looking for anyone who wasn't afraid of computers to write stuff about computers for the new internet craze and this and that. And I made a lot of money for a couple of years doing technical writing before I went back to my love of philosophy. There was one company I was working on a contract for. I was an independent contractor, and my direct boss wanted to hire me as a permanent employee, and we were all going through the process of that because this thing takes a few weeks to get all the approvals. But then a memo came down from management that said that they're doing a hiring freeze and they're going to consider layoffs of employees because the profits for the corporation in the previous quarter were down from 8% to 3%. And therefore, I could not be hired as a full-time employee because of that. That will always stick in my memory. I missed out on this job that would have paid me very, very well because the profits of the company were only 3% for the quarter, the profit margin. So they only made like 10 million instead of 80 million or something like that in profit that quarter. And like, who is that helping and who is that hurting? And if a company is downsizing and laying off employees simply to protect the profits of shareholders or simply to protect the bonuses of executives, is that ethical? I certainly at that point didn't. But then on the other hand, if that hadn't have happened, I probably wouldn't have gone back to teaching philosophy. You definitely, no matter what, have a right to not be bullied in the workplace. You have a right to not be sexually harassed. You have a right to not be unsafe in the workplace in any manner, shape, or form. The workplace must be healthy and safe for all employees. And this is one of the big things that labor unions have also done over the years. Most people think of unions in terms of arguing over money, and that's really a lot of what they do, to be fair. But one of the other things is the bargaining for workplace safety. And again, the law has slowly expanded to include these provisions that a company must provide its employees with a safe and healthy work environment, not exposed to toxic chemicals, not exposed to danger of injury. Some jobs are inherently dangerous, and the law understands that, and ethically we need to understand that. There is no way that you can make a workplace completely guaranteed 100% safe. However, it is incumbent upon any employer to provide reasonable accommodation so that employees are safe in their environment. To be healthy, to be safe is a human right. And though anyone and everyone has to accept a certain level of risk, they must be also treated with a certain level of respect on this issue. One of the arguments about that, and again, there's a political dimension to this, and this is an argument that is made mostly by conservative or right-wing politicians and maybe by corporate lobbyists, is that in terms of issues like discrimination and workplace safety, the market can handle that. It's that faith in the market. The market forces will balance this out. And that argument simply is that, well, if Corporation A provides an unsafe work environment, doesn't care about its employees, and Corporation B does care about its employees and make sure that employees are safe, then employees will rather work for Corporation B than Corporation A. And there's a certain amount of sense to that. I mean, obviously, if you had that free choice, you would definitely work for the company that will make you safe as opposed to the one that will endanger your health. But as with so much in these ideas of free market, it's not that simple. It's not absolutely a free exchange. It's not absolutely a true freedom of you can go work wherever you want. There are many, many issues involved here, so that while labor markets are competitive to a point, the idea that somehow the market is fully competitive about labor, that employees can just choose like they're at a supermarket, and I'm going to look at what is the best benefits package and safety package and salary package, and I'll go to that one over this one. It's not that simple. And there must be some sort of regulation of all markets, and that includes the labor market, which is why there are occupational safety laws, because the reality is that humans being humans, workplaces will try to cut costs by cutting back on safety measures. They don't want to spend on it. If they can get away with not spending the money to make a workplace safe, they will be tempted to do that, and sometimes do that. Remember, a few weeks ago we talked about the Ford Pinto and how Ford Motor Company said it'll be more profitable if we just let the automobile be unsafe. And corporations can and do make that same calculus in terms of occupational or workplace safety. That's why we need laws to enforce this ethical responsibility. One aspect of discrimination is then the idea of diversity, affirmative action, that because there has been historic discrimination against minorities, mostly black people, then we need to rectify that situation by requiring corporations to hire a certain number of black people, a certain number of women, etc. And that, of course, is inherently problematic because, to a very real and understandable extent, you are hiring someone who is the best person for that job. And a corporation has a real and legitimate interest in hiring the best employee, not just an employee to fulfill a certain quota, whether it's racial or gender or what have you. And so that is a counter-argument that does carry a lot of weight. It's not necessarily bigotry to hire a white person over a black person, to hire a man over a woman. Nevertheless, let me stress that that right does not completely outweigh the right to not be discriminated against. And a lot of times the reason why a man is considered, or a white person is considered to be the better or more skilled employee, is because of systemic racism and sexism within our society. In terms of law, it's very difficult to try and figure out what exactly the good balance is. But in terms of ethics about our society at large, that's a conversation that we still need to have. And the summer of 2020 is when we're really having the conversation about the role of black people in American society and how American society has treated black people historically. But one of the ways that diversity has also been a huge issue and remains a very important issue is how underrepresented women are in companies, especially in company management. I love this headline. This is from a few years ago, but yeah, fewer women run big companies than men named John. Yeah, diversity for women in the higher levels of corporations, companies, and government as well is really, really low, very disproportionately low. Remember, 51% of the population are women, and yet they're more like 20-30% at best of high-level management and owners of companies. That is not the case in European countries, where it's much higher, because it is actively encouraged and sometimes legally required to have a certain number of seats on a corporate board being female, to have a certain number of executives be female, etc. Yes, 19% versus 40%. That's the difference between the U.S. and Europe. And that's because Europe has tried to address this issue, whereas the United States, by and large, hasn't. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you hire a woman or hire a black person simply because they are woman or black. But you do need to consider the larger issue of why is it that we have these inequalities and underrepresentation of certain groups of human beings. Another issue of employee rights is the issue of a living wage. Again, this is something that's very recent in human history. Only the last 5 to 10 years has anyone even talked about this issue of employees deserve a living wage. The minimum wage has been around for quite a while in most Western countries. But the minimum wage is a very, very low wage. And as anyone living on minimum wage can tell you, it doesn't go very far. You cannot afford much of the things that middle class and upper class people take for granted living on minimum wage. So the idea of a living wage, of this is how much it costs to actually live in a city. You should be paid that much. If you're an honest worker, working 40 hours a week, why shouldn't you be entitled to earn enough money to have a decent living? Now, we're not talking about getting rich. We're not talking about being able to buy the latest new Nike shoe every 3 months. We're talking about living. Seriously, living. Look it up. I'll try to find something and post it on the site on this about how much it costs for a family to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in a city. How much do they have to make a year or per hour to be able to afford that? And in most cities in the country, not just the big cities like New York or LA or something, but in most everywhere in the country, that is multiple times higher than the minimum wage. And sometimes even two adults working for the minimum wage cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And so ask yourself, do employees have a right to a living wage? And this is another issue that comes down largely on political lines of progressive versus conservative. Finally, we'll touch on this, especially because it is our decision point this unit. How much of a right do employees have to express themselves both in the workplace, but especially outside the workplace? Does a company have a right to dictate to you, because you are an employee, what you do outside of the workplace? Now, obviously, a company has every right to say, here's what you can do and can't do while you're at work. You cannot smoke marijuana while you are on the job. I think most people can find that to be an entirely reasonable prospect and demand on an employee. But then does that employer also then have the right to say you cannot smoke marijuana in your own house? Let's keep drugs out of it, because drugs can be a weird issue for some people. Can an employer say that you are not allowed to watch certain television programs? You're not allowed to post on Twitter in your own home on your own time. Obviously, if you are at work looking at Facebook and looking at Twitter and stuff, well, you can be fired for that because you're supposed to be working. But at home, can an employer say, oh, I saw what you said on Twitter, you're fired, when it has nothing to do with the workplace? Now, you can say, well, if you're at home tweeting about how my employer is an idiot, don't buy their products, they probably have a right to get rid of you. But think about that. How much of a right to free speech do you have? How much of a right does an employer have to say, I don't want to associate with you because you make these statements, you have these views, you do this political activity, you do this leisure activity. Maybe I don't like the fact that you go dress up as comic book characters at conventions. Therefore, you are fired. Do they have a right to do that? They will say, well, it reflects poorly on the company. Well, does it? And that's where Kaepernick comes in. Now, Kaepernick's an interesting issue because he did do it at the workplace. He did kneel for the national anthem. Is that enough to get him fired? He was fired. And let's not pretend otherwise. He has been blackballed in the NFL ever since. Not that he's the greatest quarterback in the world, but he's a perfectly capable one. Certainly more capable than anything the Bears have put out in recent history. But where do his rights end? Where do the employer's rights end? And don't just focus on Kaepernick. Focus on the other issue that is brought up there by DeMore, I believe is how it's pronounced. I've never heard it spoken. And in general, what do you have to say about the right of people to have a voice? And does that at all matter in terms of their employment for a company?